You're the only one, Paul, who wants to talk to me. They're all shy.
I'm not sure they're shy, Chris, but your style is not one that appeals to everybody. I'm a big boy. I don't really mind a bit of robust discussion. I don't know that you'd have too many of the Dublin Declaration scientists who would argue that animal-based protein is not good for your health. So,
the claim is that we need meat to be healthy.
Look, I think in general the answer to that is yes, we do.
I don't think that is correct. In the case of red meat, the authors said,
Chris, by all means,
we shouldn't
I'll be happy to have a look at those. I'm happy,
I will do.
I post them. I haven't read them.
I'll just tell you, I can give you.
Anyone is suggesting that we should change our recommendation around smoking.
Well, they're certainly not, but they are suggesting that we should change them around red meat, given the same level of standard of evidence. Okay, I'm joined today by Paul Wood, who has agreed to have a debate about the Dublin Declaration with me. Thanks so much for joining me, Paul.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time. There's been a lot of people involved with the Dublin Declaration who are not so willing to discuss. Would you like to give a bit of an introduction to yourself? And I can do the same, and we can talk a bit about how we got here before we get into it.
Sure. So I'm Paul Wood. My original sort of PhD was in immunology back in '82. I've spent my career across sort of biology, vaccines, and drugs in particular. I was in CSIRO, the National Research Organisation, for 13 years, and it's probably where, from my research, has probably had the most impact, because I ended up inventing a new way of diagnosing TB, which is now the standard of care around the world. So people get diagnosed early, get treated, so it leads to sort of essentially thousands of people lives saved each year. So I was quite young. I was only 30 when I did that. I then moved into industry with companies like CSL and eventually Pfizer Animal Health in the US, leading large research teams, developing vaccines for animals and also drugs. Came back to Australia in 2012, and then I've sort of broadened out. I've done a range of things for both profit and not for profit. So I was on the dairy board, Australian Dairy Board, for 6 years. I was on the board and the chair of GALVMED, the Global Alliance for Livestock Medicine. So that's working with smallholder farmers in Africa and India, funded through the Gates Foundation and the UK government. I chair an insect farming business, bit of a sideline. I'm on the Scientific Advisory Committee for the Global Methane Hub. I'm on the board of the Australian Academy of Technology, Science and Engineering, and an adjunct professor at Monash University. So a broad range of sort of interests are both across animal health, human health.
Nice. Okay, thanks so much for the introduction. I'll give a brief introduction. My audience will know who I am, but for the benefit of everybody watching, I'm Chris Bryant. I'm a researcher. I run a company called Bryant Research. We do social science as well as modelling on food systems change broadly. And relevant to this conversation, I'm the lead author of a prominent critique of the Dublin Declaration, which we'll be discussing today. This is a bit gets onto how we got here, I guess. We've got the Dublin Declaration, which I think it's fair to say is a document which defends global livestock production and consumption. And we've got my claim that it is junk science. And Paul is presumably on the other side of that claim. We're definitely going to discuss a lot about the Dublin Declaration. There's also a few other things that I've noticed as disagreements that we might have that we can get into as well. You're the only one, Paul, who wants to talk to me. I can't get, any of the others. I can't get Pierre Ederer or Colette Castor or, my big fish, Frederick Leroy. They're all shy.
I'm not sure they're shy, Chris, but your style is not one that appeals to everybody. It is what it is, but it tends to get rather personal at times, and that's not a scientific thing. That's just it appeals to your audience clearly. I'm a big boy. I don't really mind a bit of robust discussion, but the fundamentals of why the Dublin Declaration came about was that people got a bit frustrated with some of the non-scientific arguments being thrown out, and created a forum for scientists to talk about what was the actual data that existed around where livestock fitted into our global food system. That's what started off that meeting in 2022 in Dublin, and then last year there was a follow-up meeting in Denver. And I think there's now something over 1,200 signatures to the declaration. So it really just states that livestock are an important part of the system, and here is the science that backs that up.
Well, I think that it's frustration with unscientific claims and sort of lack of context given to the evidence and so on that is also motivating a lot of the response to the Dublin Declaration. I think that it's clear the Dublin Declaration is telling a very selective part of the story. Would you agree with that?
No. I mean, I'm happy to debate any of the technical detail. It puts forward a case that basically points out historically why was livestock an important part of our food system. What is the current data around where the position and particularly nutrition? I mean, nutrition's been a pretty hotly debated area. I'm not surprised people get pretty confused because they've been told various things at various times. And part of that is it's not one of the areas of science where it's as easy to do the sort of fundamental controlled studies that are the standard of science. So you end up with a lot of observational studies. And what time has told us, these observational studies are pretty weak on the data.
We can get into some of the observational, epidemiology critique, and I know you like to bring up the global burden of disease study, but I want to stay on the claim at the moment that the Dublin Declaration is kind of selective in the parts of the story that it chooses to tell. I mean, the critique that I led focuses on the fact that the Dublin Declaration really is predominantly talking about agroecological systems, regenerative agriculture, so-called, and livestock in the developing world, with really very little to say at all about the majority of livestock, which are factory farmed livestock in developed countries. So that's why I say that it has a selective approach.
Look, again, we can get into the data on that. So if you look at fish and you look at poultry and you look at pigs, then they're mostly farmed in confined areas, and the level of confinement will vary dramatically around the world. But if you look at ruminants, it's actually on a global basis only about 2%. It's only about 2% of ruminants are actually farmed in confined. The rest of them are actually in paddocks.
Right, but they're also a tiny fraction of all livestock.
No, ruminants are not a small fraction of livestock. I mean, do you want to work on, if you work on numbers versus weight? So if you look on the weight, I mean, yeah, sure, but cows are a pretty big animal, and even sheep and goats. So again, it really comes down to the biomass as distinct from the numbers of animals. We're looking at numbers, fish and poultry are right up there. But they're also the dominant species that we eat now. So, pigs is the major, about 33% of animal based is pigs. Poultry is not far behind that. And then you get down to about 22% with cattle and buffalo, and then about 5 or 6% with goats and sheep. So
I've got to say, pardon me, finish your point.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to. Feel free to interrupt me as well if you disagree with something that I'm saying. That way we can have a bit more of a back and forth. So I appreciate the distinction between the number of animals versus the quantity of meat, right? If you're talking about number of animals, cattle are going to be, less than 1%, right? But if you're talking about quantity of meat, it's a little bit higher than that. It's still only, from what I've seen, about 26% of all meat that's coming from ruminants.
That's I think that's roughly tallies with the figures I had, about 22% and 5 or 6% on sheep and goats. So with 25% roughly. I mean, again, these numbers, we've probably got better data from obviously developed countries. It's a bit harder in Africa and India to actually track actual numbers, but I think we're roughly agreeing on what those numbers are.
So ruminants then you're saying are largely not factory farmed, which
it's figures about 2% of ruminants are, again, it comes down to what. Yeah. And even then, no animal spends its entire life in a feedlot. So even those figures are a bit hard, because obviously the majority of animals are raised, bred in paddocks, and they move into feedlots for finishing. And that finishing can be anywhere from as short as 45 days to 180 days if you're going, say, for the Japanese market, which wants a really marbled animal.
So we might be looking at, less than 1% if we're talking about by number of animals, and about 27% if we're talking about weight of meat coming from ruminants. And it sounds like we're in agreement that for poultry and pigs and fish, the majority are factory farmed.
They're in confined. I think if you follow the CAFO terms, it's basically confined. Now, what that doesn't define is how confined is that. That's going to vary dramatically around the world in all of those species. So, let's take China, for instance. China doesn't probably have it now, but it had about 50% of the world's pigs were in China. And half of those were in large operations, and half of those were in backyard operations. Now, since the advent of African swine fever, that figure has changed. I haven't checked what it is now, but it's those sort of figures. If you look at Africa, then most of the poultry are going to be village chickens, but even they get confined at night because of predation. So, if you've got 20 chickens, you put them in some sort of cage, generally in the home, because there's enough wild animals that eat them overnight time.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about like the village chickens that have to be put away to not get eaten by foxes and stuff like that. I mean, it sounds like we're in agreement, though, the majority of animals and the majority of meat is coming from factory farms, right, around the world.
Yeah, if as I said, pigs are around 3%, poultry around 32%. I mean, we've seen massive changes.
32% of what, sorry?
Of the number of the meat that's eaten.
I see. Yeah.
So if you go to meat and look at weight of meat and that, so that gives you that balance as to sort of numbers versus.
And then you'd have a percentage of each of those that are coming from factory farms versus not, right? And I grant that the majority of the cattle would be not.
Yeah, so that's the figures that I'm just trying to see. I wrote these figures down. Yeah, pork 36%, poultry 33%, beef 24%, sheep and goats 5%. I don't know what fish, but we know now that aquaculture accounts for 50% of the species. So all of that is obviously some level of confined.
Yeah.
It's going to vary from pens for salmon to shrimp to tilapia. It's going to vary around the world.
Yeah, so appreciating that there's some variation between countries and variation between species, but looking at the picture overall, that most meat is coming from factory farms, right? And this is not like a big, discussed really at all in the Dublin Declaration. I think it gets kind of these kind of half sentences that are buried in the middle of paragraphs and not very easy to interpret as being a critique, frankly. I mean, most of this is about ecosystem services and about, providing women a form of income and stuff like. We're talking about like 2% of meat around the world.
No, we're back to animals now. So if we're talking about meat, then
about 2% of meat that's produced and consumed in the lowest income countries, and I had a similar estimate of about 2% for ruminants or meat from ruminants which are purely pasture raised.
Yeah, but again, I think we've got to just step back a bit. And when we talk about livestock, then obviously one of the biggest things with cattle and buffaloes is dairy. So we consume more dairy than we consume meat. So if we look at animal source protein, the most important source is actually dairy, because that's the dominant in Africa. Many animals, you can't afford to slaughter the animals, they're so valuable. India, obviously, for religious reasons. So actually, you consume more dairy than we do meat on a global basis.
Okay, so that's fine, but so the majority of animals are on factory farms, the majority of meat's coming from factory farms. You're sort of saying the majority of animal protein, maybe you could kind of find some metric whereby the majority is not coming from factory farms. But for the most part,
I'm not arguing on the factory farm business. I'm just saying that, you look at the context of the species, and when it comes down to ruminants, then the most important thing we take from ruminants is milk. And I did see the figures. I didn't write it down, but again, you can look at it on a weight basis, or volume basis, the amount of milk. A country like India, which is the largest dairy population in the world, for instance. So while they're a predominantly vegetarian community, dairy is fundamental to their diet.
Yeah. So, I'm just trying to focus on the claim that there's a selective focus in the Dublin Declaration, and my claim is that it's talking excessively, given the prevalence of such practices and the prevalence of meat which kind of falls in this category, is giving disproportionate focus and argument to meat produced and consumed in developing countries and in agroecological systems. It's really, I give the analogy sometimes, it's like we can imagine a document coming out of the aviation industry where they talk the whole time about these great new solar-powered planes. And now you can have solar-powered planes, and solar-powered planes don't cause any impact to the environment, and solar-powered planes are so great, and put this out there and kind of take it to lobby that we don't need to fly any less. And that is what is being done with the Dublin Declaration and meat consumption. It's not representing actually most planes that people are able to fly on.
I don't know if I picked up the point. I think basically what the Dublin Declaration is about is saying that animal-based food is critical to the welfare of our food system. That's fundamentally what it's saying. We can get but if you're at the highest level, it's fundamentally saying the animal-based food, meat and dairy, are very important to our food systems.
So there's a whole thing about like the specific claims made in the Dublin Declaration, and then what it tries to suggest and what it is used to then argue. Have you seen any of the things? Have you seen the study where they survey people about whether they found certain frames from the Dublin Declaration? Have you seen that study?
There are a couple of lengthy papers, critiques on the Dublin Declaration, and I think you'll find on the site you'll see the various rebuttals to those. So
I don't think there is a rebuttal to this one that I mentioned. I don't think there's a rebuttal to mine either. Let me check that. Yeah, there's no rebuttal to my paper still, I think. Let's see the other one. Yeah, no rebuttal to that as well. So, funnily enough, there's a rebuttal to their original critique, which was that the Dublin Declaration made these misleading claims, invoked misleading frames. One of which was, we need meat to be healthy. One of which was, reducing animal production and consumption is not necessary or helpful to sufficiently limit the environmental impact of the food system. And when those critiques were made of the Dublin Declaration that it, suggested these claims, the authors on the rebuttals page didn't seek to defend those claims. They just said, no, we didn't say that. And
I think
subsequently the critics found empirical evidence that this was indeed inferred from what they had said.
Look, I don't know that you'd have too many of the Dublin Declaration scientists who would argue that animal-based protein is not good for your health. So,
well, the claim is that we need meat to be healthy.
Look, I think in general the answer to that is yes, we do.
I don't think that is correct.
Well, but Chris, what data do you want to look at? Let's have a talk about the data. If you talk about, the claims around the fact that there was linked to a range of diseases with unprocessed meat, then that's been pretty extensively rebutted now by the Global Burden of Disease. They actually corrected their own data, which was used by a lot of other groups. So in 2019, when they put out their report, they made some statements which were criticised by a range of people, and they subsequently published a review in Nature Medicine in 2022, which agreed that there was essentially little to no data linking the consumption of unprocessed meat to a whole range of diseases. So that was a pretty important, because it actually repudiated what they had said previously.
Yeah, so we can get into the global burden of disease stuff, and I disagree with your interpretation of what's been said on the impact of unprocessed red meat there. We can get into that. This is kind of a different claim to the frame invoked that we need meat to be healthy, right? We can talk about whether they're negative.
So we can get into micronutrient deficiency. So we know that micronutrient deficiency is a major problem around the world, severe problem in developing countries. But even in developed countries, when they look at, say, women are of that sort of reproductive age, then over 60% will have one or more micronutrient deficiencies. So, and we know that sort of things like dairy and meat are very good at balancing. So when you get into micronutrient deficiencies, when you look at the work from Ty Beale from the GAIN Institute, or people out of the Ritter Institute, then a lot of the focus is actually on micronutrient deficiency.
Yeah, well, and again, that's fine. It's not directly addressing the claim that we need meat to be healthy. I mean, it's a very specific claim being made, right? Like, you cannot be healthy without meat. Is another way of putting that claim, which I don't think.
Well, the vast majority of the population it's been demonstrated in that regard. I mean, the reality
I don't think that's
is
correct.
Well, let's have a look at what people's preferences are.
Well, that doesn't really tell you about what they need to be healthy, right? People's preferences.
What are we going to do? Are we going to take away preference? We're going to take away preference. I mean,
it's just a different discussion about what's healthy, right? People prefer Mars bars.
Well, yeah, we know people aren't really good at that, but we also know that there's a lot of data. You go and talk to most nutritionists; they want people to have a quantity of animal-based food in their diet. They know it's good for us. We know fish is good for people. I mean, again, it's different species for different things, but we know that people who eat have a reasonable amount of animal-based protein have a very healthy diet. We talk about the Mediterranean diet.
Yeah.
So we know these things. I mean, the studies on dairy are overwhelming. There was a 6-country study showing that in elderly people, if you increase their content of dairy, we got 30% less breaks. We got 40% less falls. I mean, it's better than we get with most drugs. So I think the data on the importance. Now, can you exist without it? Yeah, there's a small group of people who do, but they can't do it without heavily supplementing. And that comes at a cost.
Okay, so it sounds like apart from all the other stuff, we don't need meat to be healthy.
For the majority of people, they do, because supplementation is not something they can either afford or access. So if you talk about people and you talk about diets,
it sounds like we're talking about the developing world again, though, right?
No, not at all. The micronutrient deficiency we see globally, as I just quoted one of the figures from Ty Beale, over 60% of women globally in childbearing age, reproductive age, have one or more micronutrient deficiencies.
it's kind of orthogonal to the discussion that we're having, though. I mean, that could be true. Like, they could be true regardless of whether we need meat to be healthy. This is not quite on the same. So you're saying if people can, for anyone who can afford supplements, they do not need meat to be healthy.
I wouldn't disagree. I wouldn't advise anyone to take supplements over meat because or dairy, to be honest, because we know that the bioavailability of micronutrients is far better when they're associated with animal-based food. So when we know that iron, for instance, and we know that the quality of protein, about the only plant-based protein that has a reasonable quality is soy. Now, if you get into a lot of the other staple diets, then the quality of the protein, like rice is one, for instance. Rice and oats have very poor quality protein. So if the quantities that you have to eat are quite high. So again, it's not just where it comes from. It's the fact that both on quality of protein and on bioavailability of micronutrients, we know that animal-based foods are superior.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, you're taking a different tack to the Dublin Declaration authors then, who, in their rebuttal to the claim that this misleading claim was invoked, they weren't trying to defend this claim, but you are going to defend the claim we need meat to be healthy. That's okay. You could take kind of a different...
I think for the vast majority of people, the answer is yes.
Okay, well, that's all right. You're taking a different route to the other Dublin Declaration.
And again, I think the importance there is to distinguish. We're talking about animal-based protein here. So we're talking about milk, we're talking about dairy, we're talking about eggs. When we know in Africa, for instance, there's 140 million children with micronutrient deficient, which means they're runted and stunted, and they then have cognitive dysfunctions. Those children won't recover from that because they didn't get the essential nutrients in that first 5 years of age. An egg a day or a glass of milk a day would have completely prevented that. So yes, it is developing countries, but that's where the nutrient issues are the greatest. But even in developed countries, we know that our diets aren't good. I mean, the one I think I've quoted before, look at Jack Bobo's book on why smart people make dumb food choices. He explains a lot about why we know the data, but we continue to make bad choices. 40% of what, in the Western world, 40% of what we consume has no nutritional value whatsoever. So if you wanted to start, that's published data. It's published by a range of people.
By no nutritional value, what does that mean?
Exactly what it says. It has no nutritional value. We can go in and look at it. If you look at Doritos, let's say, there is no nutritional value in a Dorito. Alcohol doesn't have a nutritional value. I mean, there's actually quite nice maps where people have pointed out, they put a picture of the average diet in actual food groups and shown the fact that this is the 40%. So you can go in and look at what the data is on those foods. So that would be a great start in many countries. If we wanted to actually tackle the obesity epidemic, we'd start with that 40%. Let's cut these things out. And look, people know it, but they still eat it. So that's one part of our problem in our diet system. In our food system.
Yeah, I've got some notes on. We can talk about the obesity thing as well, because I know you and I have had some back and forth on that issue previously. It sounds like you are resisting me on the we need meat on we don't need meat to be healthy, right? You're saying that we do need meat to be healthy.
For the majority of people, the easiest way for them to get a balanced diet.
But this is a different claim, though, right?
No, that a balanced diet is a healthy diet.
Easiest way. You're talking about the easiest way, and the majority of people. Do we need meat to be healthy? That's my question.
Well, for the majority of people, the answer is yes.
Okay, but you're not. So you're not talking about the easiest way, though, right? They need it.
Look, again, what do we know about diets. We know that in the Western world, about 14% of people have what we would say a nutrient deficient diet, and a lot of that is driven by convenience.
Okay, I'm not getting to a clear thing on whether we need meat there.
So
you're basically saying yes.
Yeah, so it's feeding the children fast foods and things like this. We know that convenience has taken over. We know that the rise in highly processed food is now washing through the world.
All right, well, we can go on to a more general thing about. Okay, if I don't know, I don't want to burn all our time on that. I know we've got a limited amount of time. So another misleading thing that the Dublin Declaration is said to invoke, and again, the author's response was to deny having said this, right? It's not to actually defend the claim I'm about to give, but subsequently, again, empirical evidence found that this idea is in fact invoked. The authors deny invoking it. The idea is reducing animal production and consumption is not necessary or even helpful to sufficiently limit the environmental impact of the food system. Do you agree that we need to decrease our consumption of animal products in developed countries for environmental reasons?
I think we need to decrease our consumption of food in general. If you look at our obesity epidemic, and
would that improve animal products, or would that include animal products?
Well, I think it's all proportional. I mean, you'd start with the 40% that has no nutritional value. I mean, that could be a good start.
Okay, but
so a blanket comment to say, hey, if you're obese, cut out your animal-based protein. No, that would not be good nutritional advice.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so there is the obesity thing, which we can talk about. At the moment, I'm talking about the environmental impact there. This is the second.
So let's talk about environment. So we know that when it comes down to greenhouse gases, in particular, that our livestock are about 12%. Okay. That's the biggest issue that people are looking at when it comes to the environmental. That's why the livestock industry in particular is spending so much money on looking at ways we can reduce, particularly for ruminants, it's methane. For pigs and chickens, it's different greenhouse gases. It's not the same because, methane emission is largely a fact of rumination. So it's ruminants where we're looking at methane. Mm-hmm. Particular. So the industries and the industry has quite steep targets for reducing. So when I was on the dairy board, our target was a 30% reduction from the baseline of 2005. And we're well on the way to that.
Does any of that include decreasing consumption? Because that'd be one really easy way to decrease those emissions, right? Rather than doing things like changing diet and genetics and stuff, just consuming less of it.
It depends on who you're giving advice to. If you're talking to someone who's morbidly obese, yeah, it would probably include it. But if you're talking to young children, elderly, women of childbearing age, no, you wouldn't recommend it. You'd actually recommend cutting out other things.
But if you're talking to like a government in terms of reducing emissions,
then again, what you need to balance in is nutrition. So the advice you would give to people would not be blanket. It would not make any sense on a nutritional basis to argue. It's like let's have a look at one of the growth areas in alternative proteins has been alternative dairy. Now that hit about 10% in Australia, about 15%. It's sort of flattened and gone down a bit since then. But at the same time, you would not recommend to parents to substitute cow's milk for oat milk, on a nutritional basis for children under 5. You would not recommend it for elderly people. We've got the data that's showing increasing dairy is actually really good because of the calcium. So when you get food recommendations, they must be specific for the needs of those populations.
And with respect to the obesity rate, which I know is something that we have had some back and forth, right? We've got, I think, similar rates of overweight and obese in the UK and Australia. It's majority, right? It's upwards of 50% are in this category.
Yeah, it depends on how people morbidly obese to obese, but it's shockingly high, and these
people could do with eating less animal products.
They can
right?
do a lot of eating less of everything.
Mhm.
I mean, I lived in the US for 5
That
years.
would include animal products too, right?
Yeah, I mean, but
Mhm.
again, it's going to be contextual for where that person is. As I said, for young children, no, I wouldn't recommend that. I'd cut out a lot of other things. Sugar would be a really great one. We're seeing this debate in the US now that Coca-Cola is going to move from, concentrated, syrup to sugar cane, as if that's actually going to have an impact. I mean, we've got crazy stuff happening when it comes to, what governments are recommending, unfortunately, because it's highly political.
Okay. All right. So good. So the people who are obese, for the most part, we do agree that they should be eating less meat and they should also be eating less of other stuff, right? Processed foods and other stuff that you mentioned
Well,
as
I'd
well.
start with a 40% that has no nutritional value. That would be a pretty good start.
It's okay. Well, we can talk about priorities within that. Sounds like we're in agreement that that eating fewer animal products is going to be a part of that, right? And of course, this can be some of the processed foods, right? People are eating a lot of crap that is processed animal foods.
Yeah, look, again, it depends on where a person's at. And as I said, the biggest problem in the US is when you go into a restaurant, they sell on the basis of the quantity of food they put in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
I would go into a restaurant and, have a meal, and I would take away 2/3 of that. I'd have another 2 meals.
Sure.
It is ridiculous. But it's so ingrained in the US culture. If I wanted to put on an event to get people to turn up, in Australia, I'd just supply alcohol. People would turn up. In America, donut holes. I mean, it's so ingrained in the culture. And what is sad there is you see morbidly obese young children.
Yeah,
that is a real crisis, and that's why this sort of the GLP-1 inhibitor craze is taken off, because people want an easy fix. They don't want to change their diet. They want an easy fix, but they're not long-term solutions.
You've stumbled onto a key thing we're going to have in common as English and Australian, respectively, which is hating on Americans. So we've found some common
ground. I don't hate Americans. I've got a lot of American friends. I hate the American food system.
Right.
Because unfortunately it's quantity, it's not quality. And it's so dominant in the restaurant system, particularly in the chains. I mean, they've got a difference here. We have sort of like your fast food and then your restaurants. There they have fast food, and then they have all their restaurant chains, and then they have, quality restaurants. But the first two, fast food and food chains, dominate.
Yeah. And so on the obese issue, then, with food consumption going down, animal products as being a part of that, would you agree with me that the 66% who are overweight or obese are very likely eating, I said 80% plus of the meat? I think we could quibble about the exact amount, but it's probably going to be more than 66%, right? That portion of the population, they're eating more than their population average.
I haven't seen any data on that, on people cutting it that way. We do know that morbidly obese people eat just far too much, but mostly they eat too much sugar. They eat too much refined, ultra processed food. They don't eat enough fiber. So there's a range of things we do know. I don't know I haven't ever looked at figures that on a percentage.
Fair.
But you're gonna have people. I mean, you're gonna have people who, whatever their food preference is, they gorge out on it. I mean,
so 80% is my sort of ambitious bar. But would you agree with me that 66% is eating a majority of the meat? Very likely.
I don't know what they think is. I mean, if we look at global diet, 80% of our diets are plant-based and 20% are animal-based. I thought it was 70-30, but I went and looked it up in prep. And it was quite surprising. So it's 80% on a global basis. Now, then you shift from some.
But I just mean like of the meat consumed in Australia, right? We got all the meat consumed in Australia.
Yeah.
At whatever amount of kilos per, amount of tons per year. We've got 2/3 of the population are in this overweight or obese category. If you had to guess, what proportion of that big chunk of overall meat are they eating?
Look, I don't know, and again, I put dairy in there, so I think you got to actually look at animal-based food as distinct from meat.
Well, you could cut it either way, but I mean, if you had to guess,
consume more dairy.
Okay, well, all right. Let's just talk about meat for the sake of. Look, you could do it either way, say meat and dairy, right? But if you had to guess, are you saying there's more than 66% or less? I'm guessing it's more, right? Because they're obese and overweight.
Look, if you look at the figures in Australia, we're about the same as a lot of countries. We've got about 1% vegans, we've got about 10% vegetarians, and the rest eat meat to certain different levels.
And the vegetarians and vegans are probably underrepresented in the obese group as well, right? So you got the obese group there.
I think vegans definitely underrepresented. We can discuss why that is. But we also know with vegans that people who are very focused on their diet. So you'd expect them to not eat a lot of necessary, stuff that they would consider like lots of sugar, etc.
Whereas the obese people are chowing down on the animal products all the time.
And sugars. Let's be honest. I mean, our biggest problem is sugar. It's not.
That's okay. That's fine. We can talk about. I don't know. I don't have like strong views on sugar, but that's. I don't know. I feel like it's kind of an aside. You can.
Well, if you actually look at people who are studying type 2 diabetes, then sugar is the thing that they focus on most. I am a type 2 diabetic. Okay, so and when I go along and says what shouldn't I eat, then I shouldn't eat things with a lot of added sugar. I can eat fruit. It's got natural sugars in it, but I shouldn't eat things that are like most drinks. Okay, any colas, actually even fruit juices generally have added sugar.
That's all fine. I don't have much to say one way or another about the sugar thing. So I want to move on through. We didn't really talk too much about the environmental thing. Or you're saying that you can't make kind of blanket statements because it needs to be nutritionally appropriate, but it also sounds like you agree with me that we've got this majority who are obese or overweight. It's likely that they're consuming a majority of the animal products and they need to reduce their consumption of animal products. I'm thinking that means that overall quantity of meat that gets consumed is going to go down, right?
Yeah, look, again, we go back to it. They need to reduce their food overall. And I'm assuming that if they are eating predominantly meat-based food, then that will be included in that. But it's that sort of group. I wouldn't be recommending it to elderly, children, or women of childbearing ages.
So the majority of people.
Actually, those groups, they probably. I've already probably got the majority. If we look at women, elderly.
What about obese? What about obese women?
Look, again, what we do know with obesity in a lot of countries, it comes with age. So there's an age criteria there. So yeah.
But if they're obese, they shouldn't be. All right, I don't want to spend forever on this. I think we've got. I think we've got it. Like the total quantity of meat here, the majority of which being consumed by people who need to eat less of it. I'm satisfied with that. Okay, so then we have some contention with those frames on the misleading point. There's some other stuff I could say about Dublin Declaration. A bunch of this is about just really bad scientific practices and kind of shadiness around the Dublin Declaration. They didn't properly disclose conflicts of interest until it was called out by journalists. It's published in this weird kind of industry-owned journal. It's got no proper citations, but it's got like a link to go and see citations in this recordings. I'm not sure if it's...
Sorry, I'm a bit surprised there because obviously we presented, and the videos, those videos of all the presentations. But then there were also papers were prepared and published in referee journals with full citations. I was one of the authors of those. So you can go in and actually have a look at publication, and you can see the citations. So I'm not sure where the comment is there's no citations, because again, there's videos you can watch, there is published papers in referee journals.
Well, there's no proper citations for specific claims, right? The Dublin Declaration itself just has like a sentence at the end that says, for scientific evidence, see this whole journal edition, which is not really, that's not really citing.
The Dublin Declaration is one page. It's actually a statement. It's not a referee, it's a statement. And what it then says is, we think science should dominate this discussion. And here are, you can go and actually look at the thing. Here are all the presentations. Here are all the publications. So it's all there.
Right, but do you see the problem with making kind of broad claims, which are, again, have been shown to be misleading, and then rather than giving specifics...
Let's pick a statement.
Rather than giving
misleading?
Well, we've been through a couple of the... But listen, rather than giving specific citations for claims that are made, just giving like a dump of go here and see it.
Like, it's a one-page document. It's a one-page document.
Right, but you could have citations in one page.
What it says is, here is a statement, okay? And here are all the publications. Here are all the presentations that were given. Here are all the publications. Here are all the affiliations of all the people. I mean, it's all there. So I'm surprised when you say it's not there. It's actually all there. I mean, I was one of the ones who had to grind through and write that paper afterwards.
Well, my claim is that there's not proper citations in the Dublin Declaration. They're just kind of gesturing towards
the Dublin Declaration is one page.
But it could have citations. I mean, our rebuttal's like one page. It has citations.
Like all the citations. If someone wants to look at it, you pull up the page. It says Dublin Declaration. Here's a one-page statement. Here's now. Click on the thing. Here are all the videos. Click on here. Here are all the publications. It's all there, Chris.
So you're saying, though, that the onus for anyone who doubts something in the Dublin Declaration, how are they going to go and verify?
Read the paper.
Go and read the whole journal that it references.
No, or your particular paper, whatever your particular.
But there's no particular citations given. It just says here's all the evidence dumped in this journal.
Papers. It walks through all the topics. I think there's 10 publications that came out of that first meeting in Ireland. There's a whole pile now that have come out of, actually, I'm not sure if the ones from Denver are actually, no, they have been released. So all the papers are there, and they then lead to, like there's no shortage of data, and as I said, you can pick on any topic. I mean, we talked about nutrition, the other one that annoys me in particular is the comment that we'll reduce exposure to new exotic diseases by reducing lifestyle. Well, those viruses come out of wildlife, largely bats in particular. So it's a nonsensical statement.
Well, that's not nonsensical still, because of course our destruction of...
Where do those new viruses come from? Where did they come from? Do they come from livestock?
Our destruction of natural habitats in order to grow more feed for animals has been shown to put us in close contact.
You'll need to actually get some data first to actually show that. In Australia, if you look at our bat populations, they're largely domestic. I have a bat colony that flies over my house in inner Melbourne every night. Okay? They've lived in our cities for a long time. They weren't displaced.
I'm not that interested in your city.
No, but you're making a statement.
Yeah.
Look at, so what I'm saying is if you look at these new and emerging diseases, a whole range of them have come out of bats. We know there's something really unusual about bats that people are studying to understand why is that the case. But to make a statement will reduce the risk of new emerging diseases by getting rid of livestock. There is no data for that. So
that's not correct. I mean, you're saying the majority of new emerging diseases come from wildlife. I notice you're not saying that we don't get new emerging diseases from livestock.
Yeah, but look at the ones that have been a real problem. Can you tell me one that's come out of livestock?
Bird flu, swine flu, these have killed loads.
Okay.
Yes.
So what is the major problem with flu it's wild ducks. The major
Again, you're
movement
kind of changing
of
the
new
subject there.
flus.
You're not
No,
denying
I
that
asked you to
lives.
give me a
You're not denying that
major
livestock are
disease.
exacerbating these things.
What I'm saying is that the concept that we will get rid of livestock and that will then reduce our, dramatically reduce exposure to new emerging disease, I said is not actually backed up by the data.
Well, it will reduce. You don't think it will dramatically reduce?
COVID didn't come out of domestic species.
Well, I didn't say that it did, right?
No, but I asked you to give me a thing and you gave me flu. And I told you that flu predominantly is spread by wild ducks.
Again, you're saying predominantly. You're not saying animal agriculture has nothing to do with this. You're not actually saying if we weren't.
So what happens is that we had it in the US recently. So we had a new flu species, and we got crossover into cattle and we got some transmission. It's largely small. What generally happens in a species is you get crossover events, but then the spread is within that species. So this, the crossover events that led to COVID, we think there's probably about 3 crossover events that occurred. There wasn't a single one. But after that, it's human to human spread that spreads that. So it's nothing to do with livestock. It's human. That's what we see time and time again.
Don't you think, though, that having a bunch of very genetically similar livestock kept in close proximity in unhygienic conditions might exacerbate some of those circumstances for spreading those diseases within that species?
Well, we actually don't have the data. If we look at
I think we do have data on that.
No, you actually made a statement that if we reduced it, and I'm asking the question, give me an example of that. They're broad-based statements. Oh, well, it's, if we didn't destroy that. No, we shouldn't destroy, obviously, environments. But to say that then results in these new emerging diseases is not backed up by the data. COVID did not come out of domestic species. Ebola did not come out of domestic species.
Yes, listen, I mean, you could do this.
HIV did not come out of domestic species.
Right, but you can do the same thing for any any critique that you can. I mean, you're just changing the subject, right? There's no.
I'm actually saying, give me the data that shows. Give me an example of a new and emerging disease that came out of livestock that created a major epidemic.
I've told you.
The other one you use is antibiotic resistance, which again,
you're putting words in my mouth. I've not brought this up.
Chris, it's actually.
I didn't bring up the last thing either. We're kind of going off on one here, but that's
all right. But again, this has been your commentary in a range of your documents. I've raised this issue with you before online, that the issue of antibiotic resistance in humans is largely come about through the overuse and the misuse of antibiotics in humans. There's a very little percentage that crosses over. We get antibiotic resistance in animals, but it's largely different pathogens. They're not zoonotic pathogens.
I don't know if we have. I've seen you posting about the antibiotics. I don't know if we have clashed on it before, but again, it's kind of like, can you see the problem with if I were to say, drinking increases your chances of getting cancer? You could say, well, look, most of the cancer risk is not coming from drinking. Most of the cancer risk is coming from smoking. Now, it might still be a good idea to drink less, right?
There's lots of reasons to drink less. Obesity would be one of them.
Right, but the point here is that you're kind of changing the subject from...
Well, if you're
bringing up some other cause of things, you're not actually denying the link to animal agriculture.
But if you're raising this in the context of discussion about livestock, then the GBD data showed no correlation at all with unprocessed meat and any of the cancers, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, etc. That's right, what it states.
We can do the GBD stuff, so we only have a little bit of time left. Well, just first, so you resisted me a bit on the citations. Anything to say about the failure to disclose conflicts of interests or the industry-owned journal?
Look, I think the reality that people who work in livestock work with livestock industries. Not really that surprising. People who work in human health work with humans.
Right,
I mean,
but they
it's not
made quite
a
a show of saying there's no industry influence, there's no industry affiliation, and they did not
Look,
disclose
I
those
don't know that
conflicts as the
anyone's
issue.
actually gone out and said it. The affiliations in the publications, you'll read the publications, all of our affiliations are actually stated. They're actually quite an expanded affiliation.
Well,
If
they
you
are
look at
now, after
no,
some
they were
journalists.
always there.
I don't
The
think that's the case.
publications always had those. I was one of the people who wrote the paper. You have to put it in there.
Okay,
The affiliation is in there.
There was investigative journalism which uncovered a lot of industry links for Dublin Declaration authors, which came out a year after the Dublin Declaration was published. And at that stage, the authors put their hands and said, "Okay."
That people who work with livestock work with the livestock industry. Is that the revelation?
You know that they're meant to disclose those conflicts of interest and that they didn't.
Have a look at the publications. You'll see all the affiliations are there.
Okay, so it's possible that you just don't know this thing about the conflicts of interest were disclosed like a year later. That's okay. I mean, you don't have to know everything about this publication, right? Okay, let's leave the Dublin Declaration stuff there, because we'll talk a little bit about global burden of disease. I don't know if you have a hard stop on the hour, by the way. We're only 5 minutes too.
I'm fine. I'm fine.
Okay, nice. I can go.
I just got to cook dinner when I'm finished.
Nice. Well, do you know what? I appreciate you doing this. It's 9 a.m. for me. It's Paul's evening over in Australia, so I do appreciate you taking the time. So on the global burden of disease set of claims, can I give you my sort of understanding of what's happened there, and then you can tell me if or where I'm going wrong? So this is not a set of papers that I know loads about, but I read about it a little bit in preparation for this discussion. So my understanding is that basically they have these assessments using DALYs, which is disability adjusted life years, which is meant to be kind of like an all-encompassing health measure, more or less, right? It's like you get so many points if you've got cancer, you get so many points, right? And that essentially there's 2 sets of analyses done, one of which included all the forms of evidence and did find significant contribution to DALYs, i.e. a significant negative health effect from unprocessed red meats. And the second analysis, which used this burden of proof framework, whereby they were only they were excluding 1 and 2 star studies in the star rating system. And on that more conservative burden of proof analysis, essentially you have a confidence interval that just about crosses over 0 for red meat having a contribution to DALYs. We're saying then on that basis, I think Paul will say something like, we don't have 95% confidence that there's negative health effects of red meat consumption. Perhaps we do have 94% confidence.
Okay, so let me give you my take on it. So in 2019, Global Burden of Disease published their big report, okay? And in that report, they made a statement associating a range of deaths to the eating of unprocessed meat. They were subsequently challenged by a group of scientists. The challenge was published eventually in The Lancet, and Chris Murray came out and admitted they got the data wrong. They had inappropriately sourced the wrong data, and they then published in Nature Medicine in 2022 effectively a rebuttal to that. And in that, I'll take this as the quote from it, found weakest evidence of association between unprocessed red meat and colorectal cancer, breast cancer, type 2 diabetes, ischemic heart disease, and no data linking to stroke. So that's sort of, that's pretty critical data, and that came out of a challenge, scientific challenge. So in their report in 2019, there were 600 pages of sort of background reading. A group of scientists worked their way through that, wrote to Lancet, wrote to them, and eventually Chris Murray, who's the head of the GBD, admitted that they'd got it wrong.
Okay, so again, it sounds like we have a little bit of ambiguity on what is the claim. So you're saying that they found no evidence for stroke and weak evidence for a bunch of other.
Yep. And then they went on to
outcomes.
say is the evidence is so weak that it should not be used in any recommendations on diet.
Yeah, that is where we're going to disagree. And I'll note that that standard has not been applied to this form of evidence previously. There's actually a bunch of...
I think if you go and read the critique that was written and published in The Lancet as to how this sort of different data should be handled, it goes into detail of the fact that GBD in its 2019 report did not follow their own procedures. So there's a lot of technical detail in it, but I'd refer people to Alice Stanton, I think is the first author of that letter to the Lancet, and explains what was wrong with the original assessment of data, which led to the subsequent paper in 2022.
Yeah, so I've seen, I know about the Alice Stanton letter, and I've seen it's now the 2021 is, I guess, the latest one, possibly the last one for Gilbert disease.
Yeah, I think the 2021 data was released last year.
That's right, yeah. And the issue with the burden of proof stuff, so first of all, there's other studies, or there's other risk outcome pairs for which there are similar levels of evidence which are very well accepted and established. So there is some question around the burden of proof approach here. They use this kind of 1 to 5 star rating approach, which, as far as I can tell, this is someone's come up with this in...
It's not someone, it's a group. So there's a group of scientists who were given the job of assessing the quality of data that you use. And obviously at the very top is you've got blinded, studies that we run. This is a standard study if we want to register any drug. Now, obviously that's not possible in a lot of diet. And then at the bottom of the things are basically observational reports or cohort studies. And they make a difference between the quality of the data that you can get from those different sources.
Yeah, so the issue is, my issue with this is, first of all, when you look at epidemiology, overall, it tracks very closely with what you see from experimental studies and RCTs. I've seen numbers that they have around 91% agreement on the outcomes. So the whole burden of proof thing is kind of predicated on this critique of epidemiology, whereby, observational studies are not going to be strong enough to prove causation and so on. There is actually quite a large...
It's not causation, and let's be honest, what got us into this problem on people not believing nutritional data, and that is that the original early studies focused and said fat was bad for you, salt was bad for you. Now we've changed and fat's no longer. So what we've seen dramatically, like I'll give you an example in dairy, after those studies, we saw margarine at 30% and at 70% in dairy. It's switched completely. People are back now to butter because people have actually shown that those original studies, weren't correct. There's the assumptions drawn from them. So there's stories on fat, the story on, so now we're focusing on sugar. So it's because those sort of studies, that's why they're being so heavily critiqued now, because the methodologies are just weak.
The issue is, though, that doing this and saying you're going to only include 3-star or above studies, you fail to then pick up a lot of really well-established links. There's things about secondhand smoking that ceases to contribute to attributable DALYs if you use this method. Chewing tobacco has similar problems. Sugar-sweetened beverages, all of these things, if you use this burden of proof approach, there's studies where they're health risks disappear using that same standard of evidence. So I'm wondering if you have a similar view on those.
I can't comment there because I haven't read in that area. But all I'm saying is that the decision around looking at quality of data wasn't made by an individual. It was made by a group of scientists looking at this collectively. It was what Global Burden of Disease agreed to use and failed to use in 2019, and then corrected. So the reason they changed is that they did not follow their own procedures in their 2019 report, which has now been admitted and which has now been corrected.
Well, I'm telling you, though, that there's been significant criticism of the burden of proof framework and approach, and that using this framework, we get to the same conclusion about secondhand smoking, chewing tobacco, and so on. Would you have the same level of skepticism about the health impacts of those things?
I haven't read those reports. I can't comment on them. What I've focused on and what we were discussing today is obviously the food system. So that's what I've sort of, I'm familiar with. I don't know those reports. I don't think there's been any changes in recommendations about smoking.
Well, that's right. I think that the part that differs is the actual conclusions that the authors make from this point about the burden of proof studies and what evidence then gets excluded. In the case of red meat, the authors said,
Chris, by all means, I'll be happy to have a look at those. I'm happy,
I will do.
Post them. I haven't read them.
I'll just tell you, I can give you.
Anyone is suggesting that we should change our recommendation around smoking.
Well, they're certainly not, but they are suggesting that we should change them around red meat, given the same level of standard of evidence. So
I don't think you'll find that that's the case. I think the 2022 report is pretty clear cut.
So you are claiming, though, that there is, at least doubt about whether governments should be recommending reductions in red meat consumption on this standard, but you don't seem to have the same level of doubt for secondhand smoke and chewing tobacco.
My comment was that I haven't read those. I'd be very surprised.
Given that I'm not lying to you, and they do have, once you take out the one or two
Chris, I can't comment because I haven't seen them. I haven't seen what the other data is that.
But you don't need to see them. I'm telling you, they use the same methodology.
Well, I don't know that they did. Okay. I don't know. You
assuming that they do, though,
I'll have to look at the data.
Okay.
And actually
if it were the case that they use the same method.
We've got a lot more data on smoking than we have in food. Because again, what we do know with smoking, as we've changed it, we've seen the reductions. So the beauty about those systems is that you actually can study what happens after changing things. So that's the good news with the smoking, is we've seen the reduction in lung cancer. We've seen the reductions by changes in behaviour. We haven't seen any of this, unfortunately, in the food system because we haven't changed that much.
Yeah, well, when we get to reducing their red meat, maybe we'll start to see rates of heart disease coming down and other things. So it sounds like you wouldn't have. I appreciate that you haven't seen the studies. If it were the case that there's studies using the same standard of evidence under the burden of proof framework that come to a similar conclusion about secondhand smoking and chewing tobacco, would you have a similar level of skepticism about their impacts on health?
Chris, I would be skeptical about people recommending changes on smoking or chewing tobacco. I haven't seen the data.
So you don't have that skepticism for red meat?
Well, because I looked at all the data. The comment I'm making to you is, I've gone in and actually looked at one of these things in detail. Okay, I've looked at the data from the different groups. Yeah, I'm quite confident in there that there is no, that I'm confident of what's come out of that group. Remember, the Global Burden of Disease group didn't lightly change. They had, what we actually asked for was a retraction of their 2019 paper in the Lancet. It never happened. Okay, it should have, but it didn't happen. But we were pleased when they published their 2022 paper. That's a bit of a win for science.
I disagree. I mean, listen, the star rating system, this burden of proof framework. Listen, I mean, frankly, I don't have any direct evidence that this has happened, but I know how these kind of things happened. And in my mind, looking at that page for the red meat risk where the confidence interval just about crosses over zero, and there's all sorts of people with all sorts of connections to the livestock industry kind of involved in the process at some stage, it kind of stinks to me of p hacking, and let's come up with some criteria where we can get the confidence interval just to cross over zero before we accept it. I've been involved in these things. I know how they kind of get.
That paper was published by the Global Burden of Disease Group. Okay, they've been around for 25, 30 years. They're not livestock people.
Okay? Well, there were but who? I mean, listen. There's the BOP framework that has kind of. So one of the critiques is that the bias adjustments made under the burden of proof framework the biases they were adjusting for were largely shown not to be present in the data on red meat. There's a paper here that's, you're not going to read this now, of course, right? But criticism of the burden of proof approach overall. So there's all kinds of places where this could have been involved. Again, I'm not interested in making a super strong claim here because I don't have strong evidence for it, but it stings to me that that's something that has happened. It's just about got over zero. And of course, you understand that this having a confidence interval that just about crosses over zero is not evidence of no effect.
Again, I'll just go back to what that paper concludes, and it's a pretty strong statement. But the same statement wouldn't be made. We're just going in circles on this, Chris. Yeah. So I don't know if you want to move on to another topic, because again, we're going in circles on this.
Well, I just mentioned some of the other things.
I haven't got a reason to doubt the veracity of the Global Burden of Disease paper from 2022.
Oh, well, okay, I'll mention a couple more things that might give you a reason to doubt, and we can move on. I can mention some other low star rating pairs under the burden of proof framework. There's mentioned smoking and ischemic heart disease only gets 3 stars, which is the same rating as smoking and lower back pain, where we have no kind of mechanistic reason to think that there would be a link there. Low veg intake and ischemic heart disease, 2 stars. So there's a lot of well-established pairs of things.
You can go round and round on this. I haven't looked at the data. I'm not really going to get drawn on commenting on data I haven't really looked at. I have confidence in the scientists who have looked at this in detail as to why they've gone down. There's no doubt that the quality of data differs from different scientific designs. Absolutely no doubt about that. And should that be built into a program? Absolutely.
And then why? So I just don't see any reason to accept the global burden of disease analysis, which has this burden of proof framework with all these kind of problems, rather than just a traditional dose response meta-analysis. There's a bunch of them showing health problems from red meat consumption, but you're kind of going to this one where there's these weird exclusions made, and it just about gets
what they basically came out and said that they're dominated by observational studies, which have a poor scientific standing.
Well, they have about 91% convergence with experimental trials.
I'm not sure you're correct there, because again, that's the difference. If you've got a trial result where you've actually compared, and remember, we're talking about humans here, and we're not talking about rat studies or mice studies. We're actually talking about humans. Okay, you can't do one of the problems for us is you can't actually do some of the sort of study designs that we'd like to do. Okay, the sort of things I'm familiar with to register a pharmaceutical drug, you can't do. Okay, that's the reality. What we have done, we'll go back to the milk study. What we have done is start studies where you actually can increase the component, dairy. This was dairy component, and you can show dramatic outcomes. Okay, so there are studies you can do. You can't do this with cancer, because by definition, you can't say to somebody, I think this product might cause cancer. Can you take it for me, and we'll have a group that takes it? You can't do those studies.
No, you wouldn't want to have randomly allocate people. They have to eat red meat now, even though it's probably giving them cancer and stuff like that.
Hey, no evidence of that, Chris.
Okay, well, we can disagree on that. Like I'm saying, I think that the whole global burden of diseases and burden of proof framework is, imposes a standard under which we become dubious and doubtful about all sorts of well-established pairs of risk outcomes. There are, traditional meta-analyses which well establish increasing risks for type 2 diabetes, chronic heart disease, hypertension, and so on. Like, there's a bunch of meta-analyses which establish these links.
Yeah,
And I didn't see any reason to accept the burden of proof framework.
The reason that those were downgraded is because they were dominated by the same sort of study. If you've got a weak methodology and you run it 100 times, it doesn't make the result any better. Okay, so 100 weak studies does not actually increase the conclusions you can draw from them.
You haven't. I don't know. I don't feel that you've given me any reason to think that we should favour the burden of proof approach over a traditional meta-analysis approach.
The global burden of disease is a meta-analysis approach. Let's be very clear about that. Okay, it's a very extensive meta-analysis approach. It just
but under this specific burden of proof framework,
different weighting to the quality of the studies. I think that's appropriate. Now, does that change it in other areas? I don't know. I'll have to go and have a look at that.
Okay.
I think we've flogged that one to death.
Yeah.
If there's any other topics you want to touch before we wrap, I'm happy.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, there is one. So, I want to come on to. Let me check out anything else actually. So I want to leave this one for last so that we don't sort of contaminate the other parts of the discussion.
Sure.
There's obviously scientific discussion to be had about the health impacts of meat consumption and the environmental impacts and so on. And I think, with fair play to us both here, I think we've had a good run over that. Just to wrap up, I'm interested to know about your views on animal suffering, animal ethics, the morality part of factory farming. I know this isn't something that you talk about or write about much, but if you have any views on that kind of side of things, I'd be interested.
Yeah, look, I've been on various bodies like the dairy board. We have very strict, regulations around how animals are handled, and we have strict prosecutions when animals are inappropriately handled. The fundamental I'd say to you is that, having been out on a lot of farms and met a lot of farmers and that, the concept that they would mistreat their animals in any deliberate way doesn't make business sense. I mean, fundamentally, farmers, it's not a hobby. Farming is a business, okay? And
they do need to kill them.
I have no problem. Look, if you want to get fundamental to the fundamental issue, I have no problem with the fact that we kill animals and we consume them. We actually domesticated them for that purpose.
Well, that's kind of,
and neither does, I would say, neither does 90% of the population. So if we want to actually go out and have a vote on it, then a democratic vote on should we be allowed to kill animals and eat them, then we're pretty clear what the vote is.
I just said that to push back on your claim that it doesn't make business sense to abuse the animals in any way.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not true, though. That's not true. I mean, it makes total business sense to cram them in as small as possible, to raise them as cheaply as possible. That's exactly makes business sense.
No, you're putting a philosophical difference because the animals at the end are killed and eaten. Okay, I have no problem with that. Neither does 90% of the world's population. So let's be honest about it. If you want to go out and ask the question, do people object to the fact that we slaughter animals for consumption, then 90% of the world's population have no problem with that.
Yeah, I'm not gonna disagree with you on that point. I'm disagreeing on the point that there's no business case for abusing animals. I think there's a great business case for abusing animals.
No, not actually, because let's go back to the dairy example. Okay, we know that happy cows, they produce good milk and they produce lots of it. Okay, and so the more time they spend in the paddock, drinking and eating, so farming is about that. The healthier they are. So from a farmer's point of view,
the most productive systems are going to be Factory farms, right? That's the lowest cost per unit.
No, actually not. Again, please, by all means, give me the data that proves that. The reality is farming systems vary enormously around the world. Breeds of animals, the way you do them, the way you feed them, we discussed already on that. Okay. The reason we have, in Australia, we have a certain quantity level of our cattle are finished in feedlots. Why are they done it that way? Because the market for those animals determines a particular specification, like the Japanese market. They like a highly marbled piece of meat. It's not because it's cheaper. It's actually more expensive. It's more expensive to keep an animal and feed it intensive like that. But the reason you do it is because you've got a market that pays you well for it.
So yeah,
so it's not abuse of animals. I mean, guys, you look at Wagyu cattle. I mean, these are Rolls-Royce animals. You've never got a more pampered animal in your life.
Okay, look, again, we can go to like the examples of the very high welfare animals. There are factory farms. The majority of meats come from factory farms. The majority of animals are on factory farms. Why are they doing it if not for economic efficiency? Are they wrong? Have they got their business plan wrong? It doesn't make sense to abuse the animals.
Why is poultry well overtaken red meat? It's because of cost. People have demanded cheaper products.
Right, because abusing the animals on factory farms was cheaper and made business sense. No,
because they wanted to pay a certain price. Okay, so you match to the clients. I mean, as I said, these are economic systems.
Okay, but
you're equating a factory farm with abuse. I would disagree with you on that.
Oh, really?
Do we see abuse of animals? Yes, we do see it, and when we see it, it's heavily judged.
And what kind of things would you classify as abuse if not factory farm? So we're talking about keeping animals in cages for weeks on end, being unable to move and express their natural behaviours, being unable to get medical attention. Is that not abuse in your mind? A lot of them dying just straight up from.
If you look at say feedlots, then the animals get more attention. The last thing you need in a feedlot is a sick animal. So in Australian feedlots, they're largely outside, but they're confined, and we actually have people who ride those pens every day on horseback, ride around gently looking. As soon as they see an animal that looks in any way suspicious, it's pulled out and put in a separate pen. So the idea that we pen these animals up and ignore them is actually quite the reverse.
Again, you're kind of going to like high welfare instances. I'm talking about the majority of animals which are on factory farms.
You're making the assumption that a factory farm is an abuse. I'll just correct. I would not agree with that at all. And if you made the comment that it's abuse because they don't get medicated, well, they do. Same as in a dairy. Any animal, and remember, in dairy we see the cows twice a day.
I'm surprised you're resisting me on this. Okay, go on.
Well, I'm not, because I actually spend a lot of time out on farms. So the difference I find sometimes online when I'm debating with people who want to tell us how to farm, okay, who want to tell farmers how to farm. They've never been on a farm, okay? They make an assumption. They say, oh, factory farm bad. It's not actually correct. That's all the statement I'm making.
Okay, so in terms of the animal suffering, listen, I don't think that do you disagree with me that there is farm animal abuse and suffering occurring on factory farms? Are you disagreeing with that part?
What I say is that's why we have regulation. Where there is abuse, it is not tolerated.
Wow. So, but just even be it things which are legal, right? Being in a cage for weeks on end, be it like
there's nothing illegal with putting an animal in a cage.
I understand that, yeah, but it could still be wrong. It could still make the animal suffer.
Well, that's your opinion, okay? It doesn't happen to be the majority of people's opinions.
In fact, the majority of people do agree that putting them in cages is wrong. I've got some survey data on that. Yeah.
In some circumstances, yes, and we're seeing, particularly for egg laying. Okay, so we're seeing free range and things like that. So there are changes, but the reality is no one's backing off wanting cheaper poultry. I mean, the cheapness of poultry, which has led in America, they eat twice as much poultry as they do beef. Okay, that's not just chickens; that's turkeys, obviously, 4th of July, etc. But that's, I mean, farmers, it's an economic model. You try to give the customer what they want, and the customer wants a particular product. They want to make sure it's fresh. They want to make sure it's hygienically produced. That's what you try to give the farmers, your customers.
Listen, this is coming from and by the way, we're nearly at half past, so we won't go long than another 5 minutes. This is coming from your claim that it doesn't make business sense for farmers to abuse their animals or mistreat their animals or something like that. But that's not. I mean, do you think that it doesn't?
They're running an economic model. Okay.
Right.
If I've got a lot of sick animals, I'm losing money. So the concept that I would abuse my animals, that I wouldn't treat the animals. And as I said, what I'm trying to say is, what is my evidence? Well, one.
But if you have those animals in their high welfare, like preferred conditions, clearly it's more expensive to rear them than if you have them in intensive. This is why we do factory farming. This is why we have intensive, right, high stocking densities. We talk about stocking densities. That's the main thing.
The reason we have so many animals in confinement in America is where they're produced. When I lived in Michigan, the winters are -20, -30. You can't have animals outside. Okay, so the reality is conditions also determine this. In Australia, even our feedlots are outside.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they're pens. They're fed high quality rations. Depends on the market they're going to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now listen. So when I ask you about this, I get. I'm hearing that you're saying that standards are improving and that, well, I don't know, some bits I'm like, I don't know if that's right. On a just kind of like personal level, I guess, on an emotional level, do you have a dog, for example? Do you have an animal that you interact with?
Yeah, I've got a dog. Yeah.
And do you feel that it would be regrettable for your dog to be on a factory farm?
Again, we bred. Why do we select dogs? Why do we have dogs? We selected them and we bred them for companionship. We bred all the sort of behaviors. Okay, we've bred all these multiple species. I think some breeds of dogs probably shouldn't be allowed because they have inbuilt health issues. So, yes, I think some selective breeding in dogs has gone too far.
But I'm not talking about breeding though.
You wouldn't want
your dog to go on a factory. I'm talking about factory farms, right? Because
but
you seem to think there's no problem in the case of pigs. But if I were to take your dog and put them in that cage,
we didn't breed dogs for meat. We bred dogs for companionship. We bred in dogs a natural ability. I have a border collie. He has a natural ability to relate to people. Okay, he would hate to be confined because we've bred those dogs to relate to us.
Don't you think pigs also hate to be confined?
If you look at many of those things where they've got, as long as you give them ad lib food and water. I mean, we see this in some of the large dairy farms.
Say the same for a dog, though. We get a dog on his side, get a cage over him, give him ad lib food and water. Absolutely, you could. Of course, you could.
No.
Yes, of course you could. What do you mean no?
Because, well, what you haven't listened to, we bred dogs for a particular. Dogs respond to humans. Okay.
It doesn't matter the purpose that they're bred for. You are having a response to say that it would be wrong to put a dog on a factory farm. You don't have for a pig.
To have particular behaviours.
So do you think a pig doesn't suffer on a factory farm?
I think in the situation is we bred those animals for food production. Okay.
Well, do you think they're suffering though?
Look, in the end, that animal was slaughtered. I know from your background, you wouldn't accept that at all. But
no, I'm not talking about that part though. Are they suffering on the factory farm?
I think in most cases, no.
Okay. All right. Well, that's probably just as good a place as any to leave it. We won't send your dog there just in case. Even in most cases, if they're not suffering, we'll err on the side of caution. Anything final to say before we wrap up on your side?
No, look, I think, there are some areas where we're going to fundamentally disagree, but in the end, I think we both agree we live in societies where people have choice. We're not wishing to take their choice away. The reality at the moment is 90% of populations agree that we should have animal-based food in our diet.
I could say more about this. We do, of course, take freedoms away with respect to all sorts of things that, like, you're not allowed to eat dogs in my country, for example. So there are all sorts of areas where we do already do that.
But again, if you went out and asked people, would they like that? Then you'll probably find very few people would say yeah. So what we're responding to is
very few people find our existing animal farming practices to be acceptable.
Okay, I'll put it back. 90% of people are happy to eat animal-based protein.
They're largely misled about how it's produced, though, because people say things like most animals. Well, there's survey data showing that people are empirically incorrect. So it's not my opinion.
That's your opinion. That's also, remember, we have every government have regulations. Farming regulations are pretty tight on how you handle your animals. So it's not like this is.
We've got 95% of people in the UK saying that they find legal practices to be unacceptable from a moral perspective. I think you're on the wrong side of history, Paul. I got to tell you.
Well, not really, because if we look at the vegan, it's been about 1% for 20 years. Hasn't grown, hasn't really shrunk. So the concept of the strict concept that we should not have animal proteins, there's no data to say that people back it.
This is a more extensive claim. I have been talking about factory. You're resisting me that there's animal suffering on factory farms, or that there's any evidence of a link between red meat and health problems, or that there's a need to reduce overall meat consumption.
There's a lot of data that support the things I'm saying. I'm not saying that all the data does, but the reason that the Dublin Declaration exists is because people working this area were a bit tired of people who ignored the science making some outrageous claims. I've just listed some of the more outrageous claims about antibiotics, about emerging diseases, about links to cancer. So that's what drove it, because they were saying, I'm tired of this. We should go back and actually talk about the science. That's what drove the Dublin Declaration.
Yeah, and again, my claim is that it's very selective in what it chooses to focus on, right? It's basically a red herring overall, selective, neglects critical evidence, misleads with respect to health and environmental necessity of meat, doesn't disclose proper conflicts of interest, published in an industry-owned journal.
And exactly, Chris, you summed it up. That is your opinion. It does not happen to be the opinion of the majority of people in our field.
Well, lots of the things that I've just said are a matter of fact.
No, they're not. We just had an hour and a half discussion on this issue.
All right. We can let the historians decide, I guess.
They're facts, but sorry, they're not.
I mean, lots of them are right. It's a fact that there was not proper disclosure of conflicts of interest. It's a fact that there's no proper citations. Listen, we don't need to go round and round on these.
We can go back, read the papers. They're all there. The affiliations are there. The references are there.
Listen, I can link to all the parts of these that we've been disagreeing on, but we'd better leave it here. I can sense you got one more in the chamber, Paul. Go on.
No, happy. And again, if there's particular things you want me to comment on or evidence you want, I'm more than happy. I posted some data. I'm more than happy to post. To me, it's a scientific discussion we're trying to have. So I'm more than happy to post data on some of these issues. So again, I'll go and have a look at your commentary about, is the methodology been overly changed? Again, happy to have a look at that. But
well, that's good. I appreciate that.
But the argument that studies of a different design have more weight than others, that's fundamental. That's fundamental to science. We know that our study design is critical to the value. Of what you can conclude from that. All right, let's wrap. I'll go and cook dinner, and nice to chat. Okay.
Yeah, thanks very much for talking to me, Paul. I appreciate you taking the time.
Okay, bye.
All right. Cheers.